Was this closed before?
It's all understood.
Yeah. Okay, step one. I didn't want to disturb anybody else if they're down the halls. But, all right, so we're gonna go over some basic building blocks of Slate. This is supposed to be sort of an introductory of, I've never touched Slate before, how do we build things? So that's kind of the process of what we'll go through now. Really kind of creating the very basic building blocks of fields, prompts, and forms. So everything in Slate is really built off of fields, prompts, forms, and I'll also call it deliver. So deliver messages. If you can do those really 4 things, you can do anything in Slate. So we're going to go through some of the first 3 building blocks. We'll talk about deliver. I think, again, it's either Wednesday or Thursday, but we'll talk about deliver later on. But if you can build a field, you can build prompts, and you can build forms, you can almost do everything in Slate. I'll also add in queries on there. So fields, prompts, forms, queries, and deliver. If you can do those 5 things, you can do anything and everything in Slate. So let's go, and you can feel free to follow along if you'd like, or if you just like to watch, that's cool too. If you're going to do any work, again, build it in a time warp or a clean slate environment or a test environment if you're okay building in your test environment. Would recommend not building in production if you can do that. All right, so we're going to talk about some of the basic building blocks. Let's get that up and running. So I'm in my clean slate environment. The first 2 things that I would recommend doing is map out what you want to build. So let's go with a brand new environment. You're building a new environment of Slate. Have the discussions ahead of time before you start building of what are we trying to build. So let's go with brand new environment and say we want to build out information on inquiries where we figure out what their term is, their major, their student type, if they're a new student, returning student, transfer, transient, all of those specific types. So build out, Columbia is harassing me there. Build out on your like a whiteboard or an Excel spreadsheet, the fields that you're looking at building. So when we're building fields, there are a couple things to think about when we're doing that. So the first thing we're going to go into is database, and we're going to search for fields. And we're not going to utilize the legacy tool. They're both valid. The legacy tool was the old way of building fields. The fields one is the new way of building fields. So we're just going to go into the fields one. And let me give you a quick diagram of what we're looking at. On the right, you see fields and prompts. Fields and prompts are very closely tied together. So if you think of Banner, think of the prompts as your validation lists, your STV whatever, STV S-type, STV term, STV major. Those are going to be your validation lists. Your fields are the container that holds that data. So again, think of like an Excel spreadsheet. Your field is your cell that's going to hold that data. Your prompts are going to be the data that is validated behind the scenes. When you're building data, I would always recommend build your prompts first. Just going to make your life easier. Build your fields second. Sounds a little counterintuitive. Yes.
And start yourself a spreadsheet that has not necessarily, it doesn't get as important at this stage, but when you start importing data and you need to know which data import goes with which prompt, you'll thank me later or hate yourself later. And yes. Personally, I prefer that you hate yourself, but whatever. For those of you that don't know me, I don't really mean that entirely.
Very good point. Having a list of your fields and prompts and what's tied together, it's just going to make your life easier. Can you search for it later? Yes. Do you want to search for it later? Not necessarily. So you want to be as efficient as possible in your building process. So the first thing I would recommend is build your prompts, then build your fields, and keep your lists as well in an Excel spreadsheet. So let's build our prompt list, and I'll walk you through a little bit of what to create. So let's say we want to create term, right? When we're creating term, we don't necessarily have to create multiple term lists. Like in Banner, we have STV term, and all your terms validate off that STV term validation list. So when we're in Slate, we want to do the same thing. We can use your inquiry term and your applicant term all using the same term prompt list because they're all the same term list, right? They're all stored as fall 2024, fall 2025, 2024 40, 2044 10, 2044 80, 44, geez, 2024 40, 80, all of that. So we can use the same list for multiple fields. So let's create a prompt list. I'm going to call it, I'm just going to call it TBR term, just because we're doing a training here, just so we know that it's term. But if we're creating a term list, we typically just want to call it term, right? Down here, it'll ask you for a key. This has to be a unique identifier for that prompt list. It has to be all lowercase and it has to be computer friendly. So no spaces, no slashes, things like that. So underscore, they give you some options down here of ones that you should not use. So you never want to use things like language, reference type, payment account, school type, sex, things like that, because those are all standard ones that are already built in Slate on the back end. One of the things I would recommend doing is utilizing the knowledge base when building fields and prompts. This is one of my favorite articles out here. It's called Customizing Standard Fields and Prompts. So before you build a prompt list or a field, take a look at this because it may already exist in Slate that you just need to customize. So for example, birth region. There's a standard prompt and a standard field ID that you want to utilize for these. So always take a look, like for example, sex. If you're changing sex, there's no field that we need to create, but there is a prompt list of sex if you're going to be changing the standard sexes that are in Slate of male, female, and non-binary. Non-binary would be a custom one. So a standard male, female. Same with races. If you're going to customize your race fields, you'll utilize the prompt list of race. So I would recommend in this one, customizing standard fields and prompts. It's going to save you a lot of time later on down. But let's go back to prompt list. We're going to create a key called, I'm just going to call it TBR underscore term. In reality, you'll probably just call it term. And then we have our export labels. Slate allows you to export 5 values to any other system or label it any way you'd like. When we're talking term, I like to store a lot of information on that term. And I'll show you what it looks like in a moment. So let's create a couple export labels of term. Maybe we want banner ID because we're going to store in Slate. Slate likes to speak English, right? It likes to speak real words. So we're going to store the term as fall 2024. But we'll want a banner ID because we're going to export it to banner and call it 2024 40 or 2024 10, 2024 80. So we'll want to store the banner ID. So if I say I'm selecting fall 2024, we're going to be able to export it to banner in the way banner likes to speak. So Slate's doing the translations behind the scenes, where Slate speaks Slate language, banner speaks Klingon. Slate is then able to say, we're going to speak Klingon to banner. So we're going to call one of the fields banner ID. When we're talking term, I also like to have a couple exports in here, and this is just personal preference. I like to put in semester, year, what else? We can do some other ones if we'd like. But let's just use those as an example. If I save that, I get to this screen here where I have my information of TBR term. My export label 1 is banner ID. My export label 2 is semester, and my export label 3 is year. Now I can enter my prompts. So my value might be fall 2024. I'm going to skip a lot of this for a moment and go down to banner ID. 2024 40, let's just call it, if 40 means fall. We're going to store the banner ID on the term. I also like to have these extra fields of semester and year because we can export these into a letter. So if we're sending a letter to a student, and saying, we're really excited to have you in the fall semester. We don't want to have to do a lot of complicated logic that says if the first, 4 characters says fall, use the word fall. If the characters say spring, use spring, all of that. We're just going to export the semester. So it's going to make life a lot easier for us. So we can say fall 2024. So now we can export in a letter the year, the semester, the banner ID. We can export all sorts of data that we'd like here to make our life easier when we're exporting in either a query or in a letter to a student. So I like to export different information in these export values. I'm going to hit save on that just for a moment. I'm also lazy. So as I'm going to create fall 24, maybe I want to create all my falls first. And I would just come in here, make a copy of it, change all my 24s to 25s, and save as copy. So you can go ahead and create as many as you like. There is also a way to import a prompt list. So we can go through that process as well. I'm just going to create a spring one too, just for the heck of it. Spring, I don't know, let's call it 2024-10. All right. So now we have fall, spring, we have a couple of prompts in here. This is our validation list. Right now, it doesn't exist anywhere other than this validation table or the prompts table. The next thing we want to do is create a field to hold it. As we are, my knees are not good. We're going to sit. As we are creating prompts, one thing that we'll have to remember is on the right-hand side, you see this little link here, and everybody forgets this, is just refresh. Every 5 minutes, your list will refresh. I'm, again, impatient, so I'm going to hit refresh. It's going to refresh my prompt list to allow me to use that prompt list elsewhere. So in our fields area. So anytime I create a field, a prompt or a field, I would always click this little list here to then, or this little link here to allow it to be used elsewhere. So I created my TBR term field. And we'll see that down here, or I'm sorry, my TBR prompt list. Now I'm going to go into the fields and create a field called TBR term. Now, the first thing to think about is what is the scope of our field that we're creating? If it's person scoped, that data is going to be tied to the person. If it's application scoped, it's going to be tied to a specific application. And what I mean by that, and just trying to go as basic as possible, is one person can have multiple applications. So my rank 1 application might be a 2024 spring. My rank 2 application might be a 2024 fall. My rank 3 application might be a 2023 fall. So each application can have a separate term, and that would be app scoped. If I want it person scoped, it would be what am I looking at this moment in time? So my recommendation would be person scoped is anything at the inquiry level. So if I'm inquiring, I'm going to store it on my person. Once I apply, my data is going to be stored on my application. Any questions on that? It can be fairly confusing. So I just want to make sure you're all comfortable with that. Same, you'll see other scopes in here like organization, rarely used, but we can store data on an organization. So essentially a school out there, all of that. So let's say we're going to create inquiry information for this term field. So we're going to store this term on the person. And I'm just going to call it the ID of TBR underscore term. I usually try to name it the same as my prompt list. Now, I'm actually going to name this one TBR inquiry term, because I will probably want a field that's app scoped eventually to be called something like TBR app term. So then I know that this is my inquiry term, and then the application scoped one is going to be my application term field. So I'm going to call this one TBR inc term. And we're going to call it just inquiry term or TBR inquiry term. Foldering can be helpful. I would recommend putting it in certain folders. So for any of our inquiry person scoped data, I might put it into a TBR inquiry fields. And then subsequently, when you create your app fields, you might have a field or your folder called TBR application fields, TBR organization fields, what have you. So it just keeps your data a little more organized. Category isn't overly necessary. It will help you when you're querying. Let me open up a query quickly. When you're doing a query, and you're exporting information, it's helpful. Actually, let me show you a better way. In source formats, when you're mapping to a field, it will just help you. I don't want that. It will help you identify where that field exists. Let's go source query. I don't think I have anything I can really work with here. Remap. There we go. So this will work for me. So as I'm mapping a field, let's say, I'm going to take on this. If I do record or field, if I do field, you see how they're all other? By default, they all go in as other. If you want to organize it a little bit better, so when you're searching for that field, you might put your grouping as like inquiry or applicant or certain information here. So it will help you organize it by category. Let's call it TBR inquiry so we can see what that looks like. Then when you're picking your field type, this is where you're going to say, what type of field is it? Is it a free text field? I would highly caution you to not use many free text fields. They're usable, but they're a pain to query off of. It's going to be sometimes a pain to grab that data. Some good free text fields would be like banner ID. Obviously, there's no validation list behind it, so it has to be a free text field. But if you're picking like term, you're obviously not going to do free text because you don't want somebody typing it in. You want to utilize your validation list. So in that sense, you're going to pick single value because I can only choose one term that I'm interested in coming to. I would also caution you on multiple values. Multiple values is a pain to query off of it as well because it may or may not be ranked. So if I say 2024, 2025, 2026, when am I actually inquiring for? Am I inquiring for all those terms? Maybe, but I would caution you against using multiple values. The instances to use multiple values would be like race, would be maybe what type of pet you have, something like that, where you can choose multiple values and you don't necessarily need to search for a specific value. So I like single value, especially for things like term and a lot of those types of fields. Then you'll utilize your prompt list. So remember before I click the little link here, it populates this list. So if I look for my TBR term, which I created here, I'm able to link this TBR term to this TBR inc term field. So now I'm tying my TBR term to my TBR inc term field, and I'm going to save that. Some other options that you have here is a bit field. So anytime you're storing a yes, no, don't create a prompt list that says yes, no, utilize bit. In the background, it stores that as a 1 or a 0. 0 meaning no, it's a no. 1 meaning it's a yes. So don't create a prompt list that says yes, no, or true, false. Utilize a bit field instead. If you're utilizing, well, a bit field or any other field, label your field name in a way that makes sense. So, for example, trying to think of a good example here. Interested in financial aid. So I would say if I'm creating a field called interested in financial aid, I would want to label my field name interested in financial aid or financial aid interest. That's even a little shaky because in the background, it's storing yes, no. If I store it as financial aid and I say yes, no, what does that actually mean? Does that mean I'm getting financial aid? Does that mean I'm interested in financial aid? Does that mean I want financial aid? What does no actually mean? So try to label it in a way that makes sense, like interested in financial aid, yes, no. Interested in financial aid, yes, I'm interested in financial aid. Interested in financial aid, no, I'm not interested in financial aid. So try to make sure that you're labeling the field in a way that makes sense to the end user on your staff when they're querying. Let's do, what did I say? Prompt list, single value, and TBR term. All right, so now in my field of TBR inquiry, TBR inquiry term, I've linked my TBR term field. So now on any kind of query or inquiry form or anything like that, I can grab this field and ask the student that question and store this information on the student's record. Hopefully pretty straightforward. Let's create a application scope field as well for it. So I'm going to do records, and it's going to be application scoped. I'm going to call it TBR application term. I'll throw it in a field, I'll put it in a folder. Call it just TBR application fields. This is really helpful, especially when you're starting to embark on student success. So if you have admissions and then starting to work on student success, you can organize your fields in separate areas to say, these are our student success fields, these are our admissions fields, and now you're organizing them in a lot cleaner fashion. So foldering is going to be your friend. One thing you don't see here, we'll get to that actually in a moment. So organizing it is going to be helpful for you. Same for your categories. We'll just call it TBR app in this example. It's also going to be a single value because we're only going to store one value on the application for the term that they're applying for. And we'll choose our prompt list of TBR term. You have some advanced settings here as well. Most times you're not going to have to be dealing with these. You have, I hate how they name this, but you have unsafe and marked as safe. What this means is it's able to be overwritten or not able to be overwritten when data comes in after an is received. So if it's marked as safe, I always have to search for which one is which. If it's marked as safe, I believe it will not overwrite. If it's marked as unsafe, it will overwrite application scope fields.
Just real quick, how would you briefly explain the difference between a folder and a category?
Great question. Let me save this real quick and then come back. So on the right-hand side, these are all our folders. So if I refresh my page here, I should see my two TBR ones. So this is a good way to organize it when you're building out your fields. The categories, so let me go into my TBR app fields. The categories are a way to organize it when you're in your upload data set. So if I were to go into upload data set, what was I in before? Was it ACT, I think? Schedule update, maybe. Yeah. So the categories are when you're in your drop-down box here, you'll see most of them are other. If I scroll down, I should see, it didn't refresh. I should see my category of TBR inquiry fields. So that's where the categories come into place. You won't see your folders here, but you'll see your categories. I don't know if that clarifies it, probably doesn't. Okay. So foldering is a way for you to organize it in your fields section. Categories is a way to organize it when you're in upload data set.
Okay.
So that's probably the easiest way to describe it. Let me show you what I did for, Columbia. Columbia, I'm gonna put you guys on the spot. Oop, I thought it. Oh.
Oh, down there.
I use it a lot in form building.
Yes, form building is another area. So I like to show upload data set, but forms is also another area. This is Okta. That's helpful. Columbia's. Let me show you a good practice I think I did with Columbia. All right, so let's go some of your application ones, major, pick on. Yeah, so I did a category of admissions, which makes sense. So now when you're in your, I'll just pick on form builder, like we said. I won't actually mess with your forms, I promise. So if we bring in a form, select list, here we can say fields. Most of these are other, but you'll see some of these are like details. So birth nation, any of that. Here's an inquiry one, and most are others. So that's kind of a bad example. Let's go application scope, wrong scoped field. So you'll be able to see.
Changes that first part in the list, so we can get a list. You can differentiate between them. Any other.
You'll be able to see like these are all the grouping or the category of admissions. These are all the category of student success.
Stuff there.
So that's where it becomes helpful. And sorry, I know it might be a little small there, but this is where it's helpful to say this is the category of that type of a field. So when you're starting to build things, especially when you embark on student success, you may have like a student success student status, but you may also have an admissions student status. So it kind of keeps them separate and lets you know these are the ones I want to use for admissions purposes. These are the ones I want to use for student success purposes. I think Columbia. That's a good example. All right, so now we've created two fields, an app scope field and a person scope field. Now I want to show you how to utilize those. So we've created our field, our prompt list, we've tied it to a field, and now we're going to use that field on a form. So if we create a form, I'm going to just create a new form here. Just going to call it TBR test just for an example. It's helpful to also organize things in folders for your forms. Going to create a called TBR examples. I always create it as a confirmed active just to start. When you're creating forms, you don't necessarily need a deadline. You can. I've never seen a really good example for a form to have a deadline, but you can. Same thing. Description would be anything forward facing that you want to display to the student on that form. So let's just do that. Registration settings, if you really want to put a limit on how many people can fill out the form, you can do that. I've never seen a good example of why. That's more for events. And then lastly, notes. I do want to touch on this for a moment when we're creating a form. Notes really helpful to describe what the heck that form is used for. And this is available for anybody outward facing, or sorry, inward facing within your institution to see. So I could say this form is to train TBR on how to use forms. In here, I can put any kind of description I want. So maybe this form was updated on 2/6/2024 by my name. So it's a way to maybe keep track of who updated it and when. So you may have an internal policy that says, hey, every time you update that form, put the date in your initials. And then that way we know Matt updated it recently. So you may have some kind of internal policies there. I'm going to save that. Changes made. Okay. So now I created my form. If I go back to forms and I look for my TBR form, I click on that, I'm able to then come into edit here and take a look at my notes and see what this form is actually used for. But let's go into edit form and let's add our form in. So let's just say this were an inquiry form. Slate automatically gives us some minimum fields. Now you can edit this as much as you'd like. But minimum matching criteria for data in Slate is first name, last name, email, birth date, or any other unique identifier. So you probably want to ask at least this information on a person scoped form. If you just have, let's say, first name, if I type in Jimmy, how many Jimmys do you have in your system? You're never going to be able to match that to a person. If I just have first name and last name, Jimmy Smith, how many Jimmy Smiths do you have in your system? You're probably never going to be able to match that to a real person, and you're going to have this odd person just kind of floating out here. So minimum criteria would be first, last, email address, or first, last, birth date. Preferably first, last, birth date, and email address. That way you know it's Jimmy Smith, born on 2/6, and it's jsmith@aol.com or something like that. So always ask that information. Another thing to remember when you're creating forms, if you have your fields mapped to record and first name, it's automatically going to create a person in Slate. So let's say you're utilizing a form for a very odd purpose. You're collecting guidance counselors coming to campus or something like that. You don't want your field tied to record first name because you're creating them as an inquiry. And you don't want to create guidance counselors as an inquiry. You want to store those on a separate area. So just be careful when you're creating form. What is the purpose of this form? And do we want the people that we're creating by filling out this form to be loaded in as an inquiry or prospect within Slate? In this sense, let's just say we did. So now I have options on the right-hand side to pick fields. If I were to create a field as a free text, I would bring in the text box field. So I can bring that in and I can map it to any field that's marked as a free text field. So I don't know, faculty email address, I'll just pick for now. So anything I type in here is going to be stored in the field of faculty email address. Anytime we're dealing with the word fields here, it's a person scoped field. If you see the word application fields, it's an app scoped field. So just know that difference too. So if it's just fields, it's a person scoped field. If you see application fields, which we don't see here because the whole form is person scoped, then it would be an application scoped field if you see app fields. We'll just save that. So let's bring in our field that we just created, which because it was a validation list, we are able to choose a couple different options. We can choose it as a text box, where maybe we want to bring in our field of TBR. It hasn't updated yet. All right, let me show you how to grab that first. So a couple things we did when we created our field. We were in field editor. When we were in prompts, we refreshed our prompts here. When we were in our fields, we can refresh our fields. That allows them to be used elsewhere. The other couple things I would always recommend, which it's just something you're going to have to get used to, is refreshing your Slate template library. So just type in database refresh and then refresh configurable joins library. You also may want to, I don't know, it's not liking me. You may also want to refresh your Slate template library. So Slate template library is the legacy tool. You may also want to just get used to refreshing your Slate template library as well. That allows it to be popped up or pulled out in other areas. So we should see our field here in fields. Here's our TBR inquiry term field that we just created. So we're going to bring this in. We can label it anything we want. So internally, we want to label our field something that makes sense to us internally. TBR inquiry field. I know that's my TBR inquiry field. Externally, we can label it anything we want to the student. We can say it in form of a question. Maybe which term do you wish to attend? We can label it just as term, entry term, whatever would make sense to our outside user, we can label it. For our internal user, we want to label it in the form of a data point. We typically don't want to save the field as a question. What term are you interested in or anything like that? We want to keep it as short and sweet and to the point internally as possible. So now we've created, let's just save this. Now we've created on our inquiry form here, a field of what term do you wish to attend? And the options are going to be fall 24, fall 25, or spring 24. So how they're listed in our prompt list. We have the option of overriding. Again, these are the values that we stored. So this is where we want to speak English and not banner talk. So we don't want to say 2024 80, 2025 10 or anything like that. We want to speak what the student is going to speak. So we want to speak the language of our students. So they know what fall 2024 means. We can override our system prompts and we can override the data, anything before the caret of what we want to call it to the student as well. So maybe there's a specific reason on this form that we just want to say fall and get rid of 2024. If they choose fall, this is the GUID of that field or of that prompt. So it's going to store as fall 2024 behind the scenes, but we're just displaying to the student fall or F24. Maybe we want to display to the student. It's still going to save in the system as fall 2024 because the GUID exists. We're just displaying F24 to the students. So we can customize this as we'd like. I will caution you about overriding the system prompts. It's going to make your life harder in the future, mainly because let's say fall 24 no longer exists. We're in 2027. If you forget to adjust this form, fall 24 will always show on this form. We don't want that. So it's going to make your life a little bit harder. So I do want to show you the override system prompts, but I'm going to caution you to not use it or use it very sparingly. So I'm going to unoverride for a moment. As I go down a little bit, I can make a default value. There are certain areas in Slate that default doesn't work well. The app is one of them. So just be cautious with your default value. But I can say everybody that fills out this form automatically default to fall 24, but they can choose fall 25 or spring 24 if they'd like. So maybe we know that most of our students are all going to be fall 24. We're going to make their life easier by defaulting to something and storing that. We can also make it required for submission, which means that they cannot submit this form unless they choose a value. Now, if you default it, they can submit it because it's already defaulted to fall 24. So just be cautious of that. You can also have an internal field only. Spoke to somebody over the break about internal fields. If you have it as an internal field, it's able for you to access, but the student never sees that field. So if you want to have a field of questions the student has and maybe have it on an event form or something like that, you can make it an internal field where it's stored on that student's record of their event registration, but it's an internal field that only you're able to access and you're able to see. So internal fields are going to be helpful to you. I'm not going to go through all of these. You have read-only fields, hidden fields, disabled fields, things like that. Let's save that for a moment. All right, so now we have our inquiry form. Let me go to a live version of the form to show you what it looks like. Remember when I typed in the outward facing in the description? This is where it shows up. So anything you have in the description, it shows in this section. Same with the name of the form will also show in this section. So when you're creating a name of your form, I called it TBR test and TBR test. Maybe you want to call this something like Matt's inquiry form. Maybe just call it inquiry form. But you may have an internal name of Matt's grade inquiry form, something like that. So anything that is in your page title is outward facing. Anything that's in your internal name is going to be internal facing. So maybe you have it as something that you'll call it specifically internally, but you want to display a fancier name externally to the student. So then you have your fields that the student has here. I made it internal only, didn't I? So now on our fields here, we've defaulted to fall 24, but they're able to pick fall 25 or spring 24 if they'd like. Any questions on creating a field, creating a prompt, adding the field to a form? Yes.
Double checking. Was it under when you're creating a field, is if you have your system field set to record, is that when it starts creating like those new user entries that we don't want?
Yes. So when you're creating a form, on your form, if your first name, last name, any of these fields are record, that's going to create a person record, I'll call it. So an inquiry, an applicant record, it's going to create a person record within Slate. Let's say we were creating this TBR event on your campus. You're going to have everybody come to campus. You don't want Matt coming in as a record that you're going to be recruiting. So you would either make it as a form field by unselecting that. And now by not selecting the data location within Slate, you're just storing that data on the form. So you can collect that data. You'll know who filled it out, but you're not going to create them as a record in Slate. So if you're inviting me to campus as a consultant and I'm filling out this form, you can store that data, but not then collect it as a system field. So form fields are also going to be beneficial to you. Yes.
I think it's a bit of a problem where a form might be dual purposed. So for example, we have a FAFSA event this week that's open to our applicants, high school students, and current students. So current students, I want them to log in. I would lock the form, right? But I can't because I have a different party who might be getting in there. But if I don't lock the form and current students register, I create duplicate records, like in masses. So another example would be scheduler, where we have a form, we're opening advising appointments. The advising appointments are offered to current students, so I'd have them log in, but there's offered to students who maybe haven't applied yet. So have you found a good solution for not, I mean, I could have a record with 8 duplicates depending on how they got there, and it's getting messy and I'm not sure how to manage it.
Duplicate records it's an inevitable thing that will always happen. We want to try to reduce duplicate records if at all possible. So could you potentially have duplicate records? Let me hit that first, and then I'll go on to your question. So let's say we have this inquiry form. Matt already exists. His email is matt@aol.com. And I fill out an inquiry form and I say matt@hotmail.com. I'm going to have duplicate records because Slate's going to look at me and go, we think this is the same person, but I'm not 100% positive. Slate's automatically going to create me as a secondary person because my email doesn't exist or match exactly. So that's an inevitable thing that will have to be merged. But we want to try to maintain some control over it and reduce the number of duplicate records. We have a couple options. I would say we'd have to dig into your system a little bit, but I would say either have 2 separate forms, have an app scoped form, have a person scoped form, both do a similar thing, but the app scoped form, you have to log in and authenticate to say, yes, I'm who I say I am. I've already applied. I'm filling out this form for this reason. If I have a person scope form, then I haven't applied and I'm filling out this form for this specific reason. That's one way to do it. You can also put in, where is it? Edit conditions, where you can show this form for specific conditions, like if app exists in current term, you could do that. You can also, and this is getting a little more in depth, you can also put in different sections to say if an app exists. So if an app exists in my filters, show this section where maybe I just enter my banner ID number or something like that. If an app doesn't exist, fill out my first name, last name, email.
Logged into the form though, the conditions won't work, right? So if I used one form and put conditions on it, they haven't logged in, it's anonymous. So how would you leverage conditions if you're not having them log in? Because they won't know if the app existed, right?
Yeah. Another way to help yourself out is if you're emailing this form to somebody. So let's say you're not putting it on your website, you're sending it in an email to somebody. Append their person GUID on the back of the URL, and that will pre-populate the person's information. So that's going to be really helpful to you as well. So let's say I'm sending out, let's say it's a person scoped form, and I'm sending it out to people. And I know that I'm sending it out to people that I know exist already in Slate. I can append my GUID on the back, and it pre-populates my first name, last name, email, birth date, all my person scoped information, and it will then put it on my record. So that's one way of getting around it. We may have to dig into specifics on that. So that's getting kind of the year 2, 3, 4, 5. On the year 1 side, though, if you're just creating a term field, you'll have this. I want to show you some best practices that will potentially help you out with terms. A lot of times people will say, all right, how do we manage our terms? So let me go back to our prompt list. And let's look at our TBR term prompts. So we have our prompt list here. We can add in effective and expiration dates. So this is really helpful when you're dealing with majors. So let's say the academic department comes to us and says, hey, we're starting construction management in February of 2025. I want to start advertising it on this date because that's the date it gets approved by the board. You can have an effective date and also an expiration date. So the department might come to you and say, we're killing off construction management in April of 2024. Starting in May 2024, we no longer want to show construction management or 2024, whatever have you. You can have an expiration date on that. This is where I recommend not doing that override field prompts on your forms, because it's not going to get rid of it if the expiration date passes, if you override. So effective date and expiration dates are going to be helpful for you. So you may say, we're only advertising fall 24, starting maybe January 1st, 2022, because we want to collect fall 24 2 years ahead of time. But we're going to expire fall 24 on December, let's say August of 2024. We no longer want to advertise fall 24 after August of 2024. So effective and expiration dates are going to be helpful to you. I also want to show you what I did. Columbia, did I do it for you with the terms? I think I did. Sorry, I'm going to log back into Columbia. Where are you? There we go. So I want to show you another thing that we did here is the category. Categories are going to be helpful to you, especially in terms. I actually just learned this not long ago, and I find it extremely helpful. So I recommend it to all our schools, is adding a category of past, future, and then current app inc and current inc to each of my terms. That way on our forms, I can say only show the categories of maybe current app and ink and current ink on my certain form. So let me show you what that looks like on the form side and then back into go. So when I built my forms, if I have a category on it, I get a couple extra buttons down here of group by category and limit by category. So now I'm making it a little more evergreen to say on this form, only show the prompt values if it's in the current app and inquiry category or current inquiry category. That way, when I'm going to manage my terms going into the future, all I have to do is edit my categories. So let's say we're no longer advertising fall 24. I can make the category of current app, change that to past, and go into my, let's say spring 28, and make this a current ink category. So now all I have to do is change my category of my terms, and on all of my forms, it's automatically updating to say, these are my current inquiry terms, these are my current inquiry and app terms, and these are my future terms and my past terms. So now I don't have to go ahead and manage it on each individual form. I'm managing it within my categories. So it makes it a little bit simpler. So if I come in here, these are what I'm showing as my inquiry terms of all my current inks, as well as my current app inks. And on my app, I'm only showing these three terms. So when I'm ready to drop off summer 24, I just change the category here to past. It no longer shows on my app. And I can change, let's say summer 25 to current app/ink, and it will only show in my future terms. So it's going to make your annual cycle prep so much easier. Rather than having to go into forms and adjusting things, it's going to kind of take care of that for you. Any questions on this part of it? I know that can seem a little bit wonky to start.
You're in prompts, right?
Correct, I'm in prompts. So having a category for each of your terms is going to make your life easier. Same thing with your majors. You may only want to show, we call it program. I think called a program. Nope, major. Same thing with your category for your majors. Categories are going to be really helpful to you. So maybe on a specific form, we only want to show the category of business, or only show the category of arts and sciences, or show the category of history, or again, whatever your categories are. It allows us to filter on specific forms your prompt values a lot easier. So here we are a little more liberal with it, where we have economics as our category, but here's our AA in economics and our AS in economics. So we can group by category, and if a student's looking for economics, they go down to the economics category, and they can pick either their AA or their AS. Same with engineering systems. They can pick any of these engineering systems categories or majors out of that category. Another best practice that I found when you're creating your prompt list, especially with majors, is you may want a separate major list for applications and inquiries. And this is where I give some of my four-year school examples. A lot of four-year schools will have a major of, let's say, biology, right? So if I want to go to med school, I major in biology or chemistry or, something along those lines. But at the inquiry level, let's just say students aren't sophisticated enough to know that they need to major in biology. They want to major in pre-med, right? But at your school, there's no major called pre-med. It's a track, but they major in biology, all of that. So on your inquiry side, you may want to have a prompt list called inquiry major, and you may want pre-med as an inquiry major that they can inquire as. And the way I kind of talk to schools is say, if you recruit a student differently for, let's say, pre-med, then you do traditional biology. It may be worth asking them, are you interested in pre-med? They choose pre-med. Then when they apply, use a different list, and then their options are biology, chemistry, physics, all the different majors. And that's where they have to actually apply to the major of biology, but they're inquiring as pre-med. Because at the inquiry level, you're cultivating them. You're saying, you're interested in biology. Here are your options. You can major in chemistry, physical therapy, English, history, whatever, and still go to med school. So we're going to put you on that pre-med track. When you apply, you have to say, I want to be a biology major. So sometimes it's beneficial to have separate lists for inquiry versus application. I don't want to hold you up from lunch. I went through that kind of quickly. Happy to stay through lunch, talk to you about it. Happy to stay also later to talk about it. But those are the basics of creating values. So best thing to do, as our friends at Ball State said, create an Excel list of your fields, your prompts, what they are, and plan it out before you start building. But you need a prompt list, a field, and you can then utilize those on inquiry forms, application forms, things along those lines. Questions? Again, I went through that fairly quickly. Go relax your brains, grab some lunch, and then we'll come back somewhere around 1 o'clock and we'll continue on.
Maybe a little like. So one of the things that we found was it's helpful to know what you're doing.